The morning Stella Walker rode into Dusty Creek, New Mexico territory, with nothing but a battered saddlebag, a horse named Cinder, and a reputation she had not yet earned. Three men leaning against the post office wall made the same mistake every man before them had made. They laughed. It was the spring of 1882, and the frontier had been swallowing women whole for decades. Everyone who lived west of the Mississippi seemed to know it as a simple, unargued fact. The way they knew the sun rose in the east and the Rio Grande ran cold in winter. Women who came out here alone, unattached, without fathers or husbands or brothers to vouch for them, they either found themselves a man inside of a month or they found themselves broken against the rocks of a land that showed no sentiment whatsoever. The wind off the Sangre de Cristo Mountains did not care about your feelings. The rattlesnakes did not care about your ambitions. The drought that cracked the earth into a patchwork of brown misery cared nothing at all about the dreams you had carried from back east. Stella Walker had heard all of this. She had heard it from her aunt in Santa Fe, who had written 3 separate letters begging her not to come. She had heard it from the stagecoach driver who had squinted at her through the dust-filmed window and told her, in the tone of a man delivering condolences, that no woman lasted alone in ranching country. She had heard it from the land agent in Albuquerque who had sold her the deed to 40 acres outside Dusty Creek and then had the particular cruelty to say, "You might want to find yourself a husband before you try to work it, miss." The frontier has a way of breaking people who come to it without the right preparation. She had folded that deed into her coat pocket, looked him square in the eye, and said, "Then I suppose the frontier had better prepare itself." That had been 6 days ago. Now she sat straight-backed on Cinder, a roan mare of considerable stubbornness and considerable speed, and she let the 3 men by the post office have their laugh. She took in the town with the same methodical precision she brought to everything. Dusty Creek was neither charming nor ugly. It was simply itself, a main street of packed dirt that turned to red mud when it rained, a hardware store, a dry goods establishment, a saloon called the Copper Kettle that had a hand-painted sign with a spelling error no one had bothered to fix in the years since it had gone up, a church whose white paint was peeling at the corners, a livery stable, a telegraph office, and a scattering of homes beyond that slowly surrendered to open land. The mountains rose blue and certain behind it all, and the sky above was the kind of deep, depthless blue that back east you only ever saw in paintings and never quite believed. She found the land agent's local representative, a sweating man named Prout, in his office beside the hardware store. He went over the property lines with her using a hand-drawn map that had been made when someone was apparently in a considerable hurry, the lines wavering and uncertain. He told her the 40 acres abutted the southeast corner of the Sawyer Ranch, which was the largest outfit in the county, running several thousand acres of grassland and timber up toward the foothills. "You'll want to introduce yourself to Clyde Sawyer," Prout said, not looking up from the map. "He's been the only neighbor on that side for 15 years. He's particular about his fences." "I'm particular about my fences too," Stella said. Prout finally looked up at her. He was the kind of man who had learned to keep his opinions on women to himself because his wife had trained him thoroughly in that particular discipline, and so he only said, "I suppose that's fine then," and went back to the map. She rode out to the property that afternoon, Cinder picking her way along the rutted track that eventually dissolved into open grass. The 40 acres were good land. She could see that right away. A stream cut through the northeast corner, cold and clear, and the grass was thick and green from the spring rains, and there was a stand of cottonwood trees along the stream bank that would give shade in the summers. There was also a structure that Prout had called a house, which was technically accurate in the way that a pile of kindling was technically wood. 3 of its 4 walls stood upright. The 4th had other ideas. Stella stood in front of it with her hands on her hips and regarded it for a long moment. "All right," she said to no one in particular, because there was no one particular to say it to. "We start there." The "we" was herself and Cinder, and she was not being whimsical about it. She had spent enough years alone to know that speaking aloud to the only company you had was not madness. It was management. She spent her first week repairing the fallen wall, foraging timber from the cottonwood stand, and sleeping under the stars when the effort of building left her too tired to bother with the linta she had rigged as temporary shelter. She ate what she could cook over a small fire: salt pork, hardtack, dried beans she had brought in her saddlebag, and wild onions she found growing along the creek bank. She mapped her property by walking every inch of it. She cleared the brush from around the house. She dug out the old well that had been filled with silt and coaxed it back to a reasonable function with a patience that surprised even herself. On the 8th day, she had her first encounter with the Sawyer ranch in the form of a fence. It was a good fence, she would give it that. Solid cedar posts sunk deep, wire strung taut and true, the kind of fence a man put up when he meant it. It ran along what was supposed to be the property line on the western edge of her land according to Prout's wobbly map, but when she walked it carefully and then walked her own acreage, she was fairly certain the fence was sitting about 30 feet inside her property. Not a catastrophic encroachment, but not a small one either. That 30 feet included a section of the stream bank and a patch of particularly good grass. She had two choices. She could go knock on Clyde Sawyer's door and discuss it, or she could get on with her life and address it when the time came. She chose the latter for now because she had more pressing concerns. She had her walls to finish, and she had heard, through a conversation at the dry goods store where she had gone to replenish her supplies, that a man over at the Tucker spread had 2 horses for sale, both of them described as difficult. In Stella Walker's experience, difficult was the word people used for things they had not yet learned to understand. She rode over to the Tucker spread, which was a modest operation 3 miles east of her land, run by a harried-looking man named Ed Tucker, who seemed simultaneously grateful and apologetic. He took her around to the corral and showed her the 2 horses in question, and she saw immediately why he had despaired of them. The first was a bay stallion, young, maybe 4 years old, with the kind of muscle that came from good bloodlines and the kind of energy that came from a complete lack of proper handling. He paced the corral in tight circles, ears flattened, eyes showing white at the edges. The second was a dun mare, older, 6 or 7 years, who had clearly been badly spooked at some point in her life. She stood in the far corner of the corral with her head low and her eyes distant, the particular withdrawal of an animal that has decided that trust is a game it no longer wishes to play. Tucker named his price for both of them. It was very low because he was a practical man and he knew what they were worth to him at the moment, which was nothing, because he could not get near enough to either of them to put them to work. Stella looked at the price, looked at the horses, and made her decision. She had enough money for one, but she knew, looking at them, that she would be back for the second. She bought the bay stallion first. Tucker's hired hand, a boy of about 16 named Hector, pressed himself against the corral fence and watched with the particular wide-eyed attention of someone who expects to see something terrible happen. Stella did not do anything dramatic. She did not rush in or make broad gestures or attempt to demonstrate her dominance in the ways she had seen men do, chasing the horse around the corral until it was exhausted into submission. She climbed the fence slowly and sat on the top rail for a long while, perfectly still, letting the stallion's frantic circling gradually include her in his awareness without threat. She had a piece of dried apple in her pocket, and she brought it out and held it on her open palm, resting on her knee, not offering it, just having it. It took the better part of an hour for the stallion to slow his circling. It took another half-hour for him to stop circling entirely and stand with his nostrils flared in her direction. She sat quietly on the rail in the morning sun and let time do the work that force never could. By noon, she had the bay stallion on a lead rope, walking beside her with his head reasonably level and his ears at a thoughtful middle position rather than pinned flat. By noon, she had also gone back for the dun mare, and using a different approach, quieter, slower, no eye contact, just proximity, had the mare eating from her hand and accepting a halter. Tucker had come out of his house at around 11, certain he had sold the horses for a price that would now prove embarrassing, because this woman was clearly going to die trying to break them. And instead he found himself watching something that he would later describe to his wife as the most astonishing piece of horsemanship he had ever seen. And his wife would say, "Then maybe you should have asked her to teach you." And he would think about that for several days. Hector stood with his mouth open. Stella loaded the dun mare she would call Luna onto her small wagon and led the bay she would call Rio behind it, and she was heading out of Tucker's property when she nearly collided, at the gate, with a man on a large gray horse. He was not what she would have called handsome in any classical sense, though years later she would struggle to explain why it was that the first sight of him had lodged itself in her mind, with the quality of a thing that was always going to matter. He was tall in the saddle, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair showing beneath the brim of his hat and a face that had spent considerable time in the New Mexico sun, brown and lined at the corners of the eyes and around the mouth in ways that suggested he spent more time squinting at difficult horizons than he did smiling, though the squinting lines and the smiling lines, she noticed, were not very different in how they arranged themselves. He was perhaps 30, or perhaps a year or two more on either side. He had a jaw that seemed to have formed opinions. He looked at her, then at the two horses, then back at her with an expression she recognized from Tucker's hired hand, scaled up from the wide-eyed alarm of a 16-year-old to the narrowed assessment of a grown man. "Those Tucker's impossible horses," he said, and it was not quite a question. "They were," Stella said. "Now they're mine." He looked again at the bay stallion walking calmly behind the wagon, and then at the dun mare inside it, and something shifted in his expression. Not quite admiration, not yet, but the preliminary movement of something that might become admiration if given time and reason. "Clyde Sawyer," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Stella Walker," she said. "Bought the 40 acres on your southeast corner." Something else moved across his face then, some complicated mixture of things she couldn't fully read. He said, "I know, Prout told me." "Then you'll know," she said pleasantly, "that your fence is 30 feet into my property on the western boundary." A silence settled between them like dust after a wind. "That fence," he said carefully, "has been in that position for 11 years. "I imagine it has," Stella said. "Doesn't change the property line." He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back at him with the same equanimity she had used on the bay stallion, which was to say, without threat or retreat, just steady presence. "I'll have my man look at the survey," he said. "I have already looked at the survey," she said. "Or near enough to one, given that Prout's map appears to have been drawn by someone in considerable haste. I'll be confirming with the Territorial Land Office when I next go to Santa Fe. Until then, I'm not asking you to move the fence. I'm only letting you know the situation as I understand it, so that we are not surprised by each other later." Another silence. Then something happened on his face that she was fairly sure, from its brevity and its self-consciousness, was the beginning of a smile that he had decided to postpone. "All right," he said. "Welcome to Dusty Creek, Miss Walker." "Thank you, Mr. Sawyer," she said, and clicked her tongue at Cinder and drove her wagon with her two newly acquired horses out through the gate and up the track toward her 40 acres, feeling his eyes on her back until the track curved and she was out of sight. She thought about him twice more that day, which was 2 times more than she generally thought about people she had just met. She noted this and set it aside. In the following days, she built her routine. She was up before the sun and working by the time the sky went orange, and she did not stop until she had lost the light. She worked the bay stallion in the mornings, building on what she had started at Tucker's, teaching him that the world would not kill him if he stood still, and that the person on his back was not a predator but a partner. She worked the dun mare in the afternoons, the gentler work, rebuilding trust in small and patient increments. She repaired her house. She cleared a section of ground for a kitchen garden. She found that she could fish the creek with reasonable success, which supplemented her dwindling provisions. She rode into Dusty Creek once a week for what she needed from the dry goods store, and she gradually made herself known by her presence, by her quietness, and by the fact that she was visibly not breaking. The three men who had laughed at her on the first day stopped laughing by the third week, because by the third week the 40 acres to the southeast of the Sawyer Ranch was beginning, in its own early way, to look like the thing it was trying to become, which was a working farm. She saw Clyde Sawyer twice from a distance during those early weeks. Once across the fence, where he was riding the fence line on his gray horse and paused, at a distance of perhaps 200 yards, and looked across at her property for a moment before riding on. Once in town, at the dry goods store, where he had come in while she was at the counter and had tipped his hat and said, "Miss Walker," and she had said, "Mr. Sawyer," and that had been the entirety of that particular conversation. She learned things about him from the town, the way you learn things in small places without particularly trying. That the Sawyer Ranch had been in his family since his father had come out from Missouri in 1856. That his mother had died of fever when he was 12. That his father had died 3 years ago, leaving Clyde the ranch and a considerable amount of debt that he had been methodically paying down ever since. That he ran cattle mostly, some horses, that he was known as a fair employer and a hard worker, that he was not given to excess at the saloon or excess of temper at his men, that he had been briefly engaged to a woman in Santa Fe 5 years ago, and that it had ended in some way that people in Dusty Creek seemed reluctant to specify, and which she did not press them on. She learned one other thing about him, from Tucker's hired hand Hector, who turned up on her property one morning to ask if she needed help with any heavy work in exchange for a wage which she appreciated and accepted, and who told her in the course of a morning's conversation that Clyde Sawyer had a problem with his horses. "What kind of problem?" Stella asked, not looking up from the fence post she was setting. "He can't get his new stallion broke," Hector said. "He bought him over the winter from a breeder up near Taos, supposed to be out of good stock, but the horse won't take a rider and it's kicked 3 of his men. 2 of them quit after. He's been trying for months." Stella stood up straight and looked across at the Sawyer fence line. "Has he?" she said. The next morning she was working Rio, the bay stallion, in her open field. She had a length of rope and a good deal of patience and the morning sun, and she was doing what she always did, moving in slow, patient circles, asking and releasing, the whole conversation of horsemanship conducted not in words but in pressure and the absence of pressure. Rio was coming along beautifully. He was a horse with real intelligence, and, once his anxiety had been addressed, he was proving to be quick to learn and eager in a way that was a genuine pleasure. She was so absorbed in her work that she did not hear the horse approaching on the other side of the fence until it was close, and she looked up and found Clyde Sawyer there on his gray, watching her. He had stopped at the fence, and he was watching the way she moved with the stallion, and his face had the particular quality of concentration she had come to associate with men who were genuinely trying to understand something rather than simply waiting for a performance to end. She kept working. She did not perform for watchers, but she did not stop for them either. After some minutes he called out, "How long have you been doing that?" She brought Rio to a halt and turned to face the fence. "What specifically?" "Working horses that way. Since I was about 7, she said. "My father kept horses in Kansas. He had ideas about how to work them that were not conventional. He passed them to me." He was quiet for a moment, turning something over, then, "My new stallion has put 3 men in the dirt. 2 of them won't come back." "I heard," she said. His jaw worked slightly. "I don't suppose you'd be willing to take a look at him." She considered this. Not whether to say yes, she already knew she would, but how to say it in a way that established the right terms. She was not going to be the woman who was patted on the head and thanked for her interesting trick. She was a person with genuine knowledge and genuine skill, and she wanted to be met in that place. "I'll look at him," she said, But I want to be clear, if I think I can work with him, I will, but I won't be rushed, and I won't have interference from your men while I'm doing it. They can watch if they like, but I need quiet and I need the space to work my way." He looked at her steadily. "That's reasonable," he said. "Also," she said, "your fence is still 30 feet into my property." Something moved in his face. She thought it might have been a laugh he had decided to keep from escaping. "I know," he said. "I had my foreman look at it. You're right." "I usually am," she said. He was definitely not smiling now, with some considerable effort. "When can you come?" "I'll come tomorrow morning," she said. "Early." She came at first light, riding Cinder over to the Sawyer Ranch gate, which was a substantial affair with the ranch name burned into a crossbeam overhead in letters that meant it. She rode up the lane to the main house, which was a thing of genuine substance, 2 stories of timber and adobe in good repair, with a porch across the front and cottonwood trees that had been there long enough to be impressive. The working buildings of the ranch spread out to one side: barn, bunkhouse, stables, a forge, corrals of various sizes. She could see horses in several of the corrals, good-looking animals in the main, well-kept and settled. Clyde was at the main corral when she arrived, standing at the fence with a man she would come to know as Ramon, his foreman, a compact, dark-haired Mexican-American man of about 45 with a face that had seen everything and filed it all away for future reference. In the far corral alone was the stallion. He was magnificent and he was terrified, and those two things were so thoroughly mixed together as to be inseparable. He was a dark liver chestnut, nearly brown, with a black mane and tail, a deep chest and legs that suggested he could cover ground like weather. He was pacing the corral fence in the same tight, frantic pattern she had seen in Rio at Tucker's place, except that his was worse. There was a quality of desperation to it, an animal that had been pushed past its natural anxiety into something that sat closer to the edge of wildness than it should have been allowed to reach. She did not dismount immediately. She sat on Cinder and watched him. "What did they do with him?" she asked. Clyde was standing beside her horse, and he looked uncomfortable with the question in the specific way of a person who knows the answer is not going to reflect well. The first man tried to rope and throw him, tie-down method. Second man tried to get on him from a squeeze in the chute. Third man got on him in the open corral and rode him until he threw him, which took about 8 seconds. Stella said nothing for a moment. She watched the stallion pacing. "How many times did each of them do those things?" she said, and it was not quite a question. "Several," he said, and the word sat there with its full weight. "All right," she said. She dismounted from Cinder and handed the reins to Ramon, who took them with the careful manner of a man who understood he was in the presence of something worth paying attention to. She walked to the corral fence, not quickly, and climbed up to sit on the top rail the way she had at Tucker's place. The stallion saw her immediately and veered away. She sat. Ramon watched. 2 of the ranch hands had drifted in from the direction of the bunkhouse and taken positions along the fence with the specific casual quality of men who were pretending they happened to be there. Clyde stood at the corner of the fence nearest to her. She sat for a long time. The morning moved from pale to bright. The stallion's pacing slowed its frantic edge as her stillness accumulated. She talked to him, not commands, just sound, a low and even murmur that had no urgency in it, that said only in the language of tone that there was no emergency here and there was no threat, and that the next moment was going to be as quiet as this one. By 9 in the morning, the stallion had slowed from frantic pacing to wary standing. By 10, he had taken 3 steps in her direction before shying away. By 11, she was inside the corral with a length of rope and a measured patience, moving in the specific way that asked without demanding and released without abandoning. By noon, the liver chestnut stallion was walking on a lead rope in a circle around her, his head level, his ears at a curious forward tilt, the desperation in him not gone but receded, like a tide going out. She brought him to a stop and rubbed him on the neck in the spot behind the ear that horses find reliably comforting, and he stood and accepted it, and she could feel the tremble in him as he chose, in that moment, the difficult thing which was to trust. She became aware that the fence was entirely lined with people. Ramon was there, and the two hands who had been pretending to happen by, and two more who had given up pretending, and the cook, an older Mexican woman named Dolores who had apparently been watching from the kitchen window, and then decided the window was insufficient, and Clyde. Clyde was standing at the fence with his hat in his hands. She had not seen him take it off. It gave her a view of his face that was slightly different from any she'd had before. And what she saw there was not the measured assessment of their earlier meetings, but something more unguarded, a kind of frank astonishment that he was not trying particularly hard to conceal. She walked the stallion back to the fence and stopped in front of Clyde. "His name should be something that gives him dignity," she said. "He's earned it." Clyde looked at the horse for a moment and then at her. "What would you call him?" "That's not my call," she said. "He's your horse," he thought. "Coronado," he said. She nodded. "That'll do." She came back the next day and the day after and the day after that. The routine established itself naturally. She worked her own land in the morning, rode over to the Sawyer ranch by mid-morning, worked Coronado for 2 hours, rode home. Clyde was usually present. Not always at the fence. Sometimes he was working nearby, moving hay, checking equipment, speaking with Ramon about the day's work, but present in the way of a man who has found that one part of his yard has become interesting to him without his fully intending it. On the 4th day, he leaned on the corral fence while she was working Coronado through a series of ground exercises and said, "How do you know when to push and when to wait?" She looked up. He was watching Coronado, not her, and his expression was the same concentrated, earnest attention she had noticed before. "Feel," she said. "That's not something you can teach someone," he said. "It absolutely is," she said. "Come in here." He blinked. "In the corral. That's what I said." He was through the fence in a moment, hat back on, moving with the careful deliberateness of a man who was not sure what he was getting into but had decided to get into it anyway. She watched him cross to where she stood with Coronado. "Stand here," she said, positioning him beside her but slightly behind. "Don't move. Don't look at him directly. Let him know you're there without making it a thing." He did as she said, which surprised her a little, though perhaps it shouldn't have. She had begun to understand that whatever Clyde Sawyer was, he was not a man who was too proud to learn. Coronado regarded him sideways, ears moving, nostrils reading the air. "He's deciding whether you're a threat," she said quietly. "Every living creature does this all the time. We do it too, we've just forgotten we're doing it. He can't forget." Clyde was quiet, standing still with a quality of stillness that was better than she had expected from a man who generally moved through his world with such purposeful energy. "When he drops his head," she said, "that's him releasing tension. Watch for it." They stood. 30 seconds, a minute. And then Coronado's head came down a few inches slowly, and one hind leg shifted under him in the relaxed posture of a horse that has decided to stand rather than flee. "There," she said. Clyde let out a slow breath. "How do you see that?" "Practice," she said, "and caring enough to look." He turned and looked at her then, and she was close enough to see exactly what was in his face, which was more than she had bargained for in this particular moment. She turned back to Coronado with a small, deliberate adjustment of her attention. "Walk with me," she said. "Keep your position, just walk when I walk." They walked together with the horse, and he learned to move the way she moved, and it was the strangest lesson she had ever taught, not because it was difficult but because of how naturally it went, because of how quickly he absorbed the information, because of the odd rightness of having him beside her in the corral. The two of them calibrated to the same quiet task. When they finished, and she had settled Coronado in the corral with his hay, they stood at the fence for a moment in the afternoon light. "You're a natural learner," she said. "That's a genuine gift." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I haven't been called that before. What have you been called?" "Stubborn," he said. "Serious, particular about fences." She laughed. It surprised her, not the laugh itself but the ease of it, how it arrived without the usual deliberate permission she gave things. He looked slightly surprised by it too, and then he smiled, and it was, in the end, a very good smile, quiet and genuine, not performing anything. "I'm sorry about the fence," he said. "Are you?" "The fence itself I'm not sorry about. It was doing its job for 11 years. But I didn't survey properly when I had the chance, and that's on me. I'll have Ramon move it." "I'd appreciate that," she said. He nodded. A pause, then, "You'll come back tomorrow?" "I said I would work with your horse until he's rideable." "That's not why I'm asking," he said, and then seemed to feel the full weight of what he had said, and added nothing more, just looked at her with the steady, unperformative attention she was coming to associate entirely with him, and waited. She looked back at him. The afternoon was sliding toward evening, and the mountains behind the ranch had gone purple and gold, and the shadows of the cottonwoods were long across the yard. "I'll come back tomorrow," she said. She rode home in the gathering dark and thought about the way he had smiled. She thought about it for considerably longer than she thought was warranted, and she was a woman who had always been honest with herself, so she acknowledged it and then tried to work out what to do with it. The answer she arrived at after some deliberation was nothing for now. She had a property to build. She had horses to work. She had a life to construct from the ground up in a place that had been told it would defeat her, and the best response she could make to that particular prediction was to be too busy to notice if it was trying. But she thought about his smile. The fence was moved within the week. She watched from a distance as Ramon and two hands spent half a morning pulling the old posts and setting new ones, 10 feet inside the new line she had staked according to the Territorial Land Office's official survey that she had gone to Santa Fe to obtain. Clyde had not been present for it. She had received a note through Prute's office, short and direct. "Survey completed. New line confirmed. Fence moved accordingly. My apologies for the inconvenience. C. Sawyer." Nothing more and nothing less, and she respected him for that. She continued her work with Coronado. He came on beautifully, faster than she had expected given the setback of his early handling, because his fundamental nature was a good one, curious, intelligent, willing. By the 3rd week she had him accepting a saddle pad, and by the 4th week she had a blanket and saddle on him and had done the first preliminary mounting, just rising up to put weight in the stirrup and releasing. Nothing more, asking his feet to stay still while the world changed slightly overhead him. Clyde was at the fence every day now. He stopped pretending to have other business nearby, and simply came to the fence and watched, and sometimes came inside the corral when she invited him, which she did regularly now, because he was genuinely good at it. He had the physical intelligence of a man who had spent his life in physical work, and he had an instinctive patience that surprised her given his general quality of forward energy. He absorbed what she showed him the way good ground absorbs rain, completely and without waste. Their conversations during and after these sessions became longer. They ranged from horses to the particulars of land management to the question of water rights, which was a complicated and often contentious matter in the territory, to the difficulty of hiring reliable hands, to books he had, she discovered with some pleasure, a substantial collection of them in the ranch house, accumulated by his father and added to by himself, and he read widely and thought carefully about what he read. He came over to her property one evening with his foreman to look at the roof of her house, which she had repaired, but which had a section she was not entirely confident in. "The pitch is off here," he said, standing on the roof with the directness of a man stating a fact, not criticizing. "The rain will pool." "I know," she said. "I haven't had time to address it." "I'll send my man Thursday," he said. "I'll pay for the labor," she said. He opened his mouth. "I'll pay for the labor," she said again, with a pleasantness that left no room for argument. He closed his mouth and then said, "All right," and she thought she saw again that almost smile. Hector, Tucker's hired hand, who had been working for her 3 days a week since the beginning, had noticed things. He was a perceptive 16-year-old, which was the most dangerous kind of 16-year-old in close proximity to a developing situation, and one morning while they were building a small stable frame he said, without prelude, "Mr. Sawyer rides by here a lot." "He has a ranch," Stella said. His land is all around mine. He rides by here a lot specifically, Hector clarified. Stella handed him a length of timber. Hold that end. Hector held the end. He looks over, he said. People look at things, Stella said. Hector was 15 seconds of quiet. Then, my mother says he hasn't called on a woman in Dusty Creek since the Santa Fe situation. What is the Santa Fe situation? Stella asked before she could stop herself. Woman he was supposed to marry decided she didn't want to live on a ranch after all, Hector said. Went back east. My mother says it changed him, made him more closed. Stella nailed the timber in place. She was thinking about this more than was strictly necessary for the construction of a stable. Hector, she said, hold the other end now. On a Tuesday evening in late April, with the sky going extraordinary colors over the mountains and the air warm with the season's full arrival, Clyde came to her property for no stated reason and stood at her gate and called hello. She came out of the stable where she had been checking on Luna's hoof, which had picked up a stone bruise, and he was standing there in the evening light with his hat in his hand, and she thought, not for the first time, that the frontier had produced very few things as simply good to look at as Clyde Sawyer at the end of a day. Did you need something? She asked. No, he said. I was riding by. You were riding by your own ranch in the direction of my gate. That's true, he said, with a directness that admitted the illogic without embarrassment. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, I was about to make coffee, if you want to sit on the porch. He tied his horse to the post and came through the gate and sat on the porch she had built in her second week, and she made coffee inside on the small cast iron stove, and she brought it out with 2 cups and sat in the chair across from him. They talked for 2 hours. She did not fully account for the time as it passed. They talked about the territory, about the question of whether New Mexico would achieve statehood in their lifetimes, about the railroad that everyone knew was coming and what it would do to the region, about the Apache situation to the south, where Geronimo and his band were still running from the army, and the complex injustice of it all, the way the Apache had been pushed off land their people had known for generations, shunted onto reservations that were bad land, and then punished for not accepting it as adequate. Stella had strong opinions on this. She had grown up hearing it discussed in Kansas, where the displacement of the Plains tribes had been a living memory in the community she had come from. My father said the territorial government will look back on these years with shame, Clyde said. He wasn't usually a man who thought that way. He was practical to the point of being hard, but that he felt strongly about. He sounds like a man worth knowing, she said. He was, Clyde said. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. He would have liked you, I think. The evening had gone dark around them, and the stars over the mountains were out in the extravagant way of high desert skies, and they were talking in the way of people for whom words have stopped being a performance and become simply the medium through which 2 minds are genuinely meeting. Why did you come here? He asked. Not unkindly, just wanting to know. She thought about this carefully because she wanted to give him the real answer. Because I had been in one place my whole life, she said. I grew up in Wichita, worked horses there, watched the town fill up with cattle drives and commerce and a particular kind of loudness. And every person who knew me had an idea about what my life should look like, and those ideas didn't match the one I had, and I had a chance to go somewhere where no one had any ideas about me yet, and I took it. What's your idea? He asked. Of what your life should look like. This, she said, and the simplicity of it surprised even her. Land, work that means something, horses I've trained myself, a house I've built with my hands, and enough silence to hear myself think. He was quiet for a moment. That's not a small thing to want. No, she said, but it's an honest one. He left when the moon was well up, and he said good night at the gate and rode off into the dark, and she stood on the porch and listened to the sound of his horse on the track until she couldn't hear it any more. And then she went inside and sat by the stove for a while and was very honest with herself about what was happening to her. And then she went to bed and didn't sleep for a long time. The following Sunday, which was the one day of the week she allowed herself to ease the pace of work without stopping entirely, she was at the creek, washing clothes on the flat rocks the way she had done every week since her arrival, when she heard a horse and looked up and Clyde was there on the gray horse, carrying something wrapped in cloth. "Dollars sent bread," he said. "She made extra." She looked at the wrapped bundle. "Dollars makes extra bread that specifically needs to be delivered to my property on a Sunday morning." "She's generous," he said. She stood up from the rocks and dried her hands on her skirt. "Get down and have some of that bread then," she said. "Since you brought it all the way over." He dismounted and tied the gray to a cottonwood branch, and they sat on the flat rocks by the creek in the Sunday morning light and ate Dollars bread, which was very good, dense and slightly sweet, with a hint of something spiced that she couldn't name. The creek moved over its rocks in its perpetual murmuring. A meadowlark was singing somewhere in the grass. The mountains were clear and close-looking in the way they sometimes got in the late spring, when the air was clean enough to make distance seem like an illusion. "Tell me about your horses," he said. "Before Rio and Luna, where did you learn all of it?" She told him about her father, Henry Walker, who had been a methodical and deeply curious man who read everything he could find about how horses thought and learned, and who had developed, over years of observation, a set of practices that were his own synthesis of what he had read and seen and tried. She had grown up in the corral and in the stable and on horseback, and he had explained everything to her as he worked. Not because he thought she would become a horsewoman, but because explaining was simply how he processed what he knew, and she had absorbed it because it made complete and beautiful sense to her in a way that most of the world's other systems did not. "He died 4 years ago," she said. "My mother had died when I was 10, so after my father there was no particular reason to stay in Wichita." "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it in the specific, uncomplicated way of a person who has also lost both parents and knows exactly the shape of that absence. She looked at the creek. "What he gave me was worth more than most things," she said. "That's a good inheritance." "It is," he said. He picked up a flat stone and turned it over in his hands and then set it down on the rock beside him. "Can I ask you something that is perhaps not my business?" "You can ask," she said. "I'll decide about answering. Did you not want to stay?" "In Wichita, with someone, was there not a—" He stopped. She understood what he was asking and considered the most accurate answer. "There were people who wanted me to stay," she said. "I did not want the same things they wanted. The idea they had of me and the idea I had of myself were very different things, and I couldn't spend my life being the person someone else had imagined." He looked at the stone he had set down. "I understand that," he said. "I know," she said. "I think you do." He looked up at her then, and there was something between them in the warm Sunday morning air that had been there for some weeks, building carefully the way the spring had built from frost edge to warm, and she was aware of it the way you are aware of weather when you are skilled at reading weather. She said, "Your horse is getting into my creek." He turned. His gray had, in fact, waded ankle-deep into the creek and was drinking with complete serenity. "Rascal," he said, standing, and she stood too, and they were standing very close together on the flat rock in the sunlight, and he looked at her with the gray horse drinking behind him and said, quietly, "Stella." She looked at him. "I would like to call on you properly," he said, "if that's something you would consider." She took a breath of the clean mountain air. "I think you've been calling on me for about 6 weeks," she said. He smiled, the full smile this time, not the restrained one, the one that used all the lines around his eyes, and it was, as she had suspected it might be, devastating. "Then I'd like to make it official," he said. "All right," she said. He came for Sunday dinners. He came on Wednesday evenings. She continued going to the ranch to work Coronado, and now they worked together, because Coronado was ready to begin accepting a rider and she needed Clyde to be the one who learned to ride him, since the horse would ultimately be his. This meant that she was teaching Clyde Sawyer, a man who had ridden horses his entire life, how to ride in an entirely different mode. It was, in some ways, the most telling thing she had yet learned about him, that he was willing to do this. It required a complete surrender of the expert's certainty, the setting aside of everything he thought he knew in favor of the quieter, more listening posture she was asking him to inhabit. Most men found this impossible. Clyde found it difficult and did it anyway. She stood in the center of the corral and watched him and coached him as he sat on Coronado, who was walking in slow circles. And she said things like, "Soften your lower back and less leg, just think about where you want to go, and you're holding your breath," and he would adjust. And she would see Coronado's ear tip back toward him, reading him, and the conversation between horse and rider become incrementally more fluent. "There," she said one morning, when Coronado had dropped into a smooth trot with Clyde sitting quietly in the saddle, the two of them moving together with the beginning of real harmony. "There it is." Clyde brought the horse to a stop and was breathing hard, not from effort but from concentration, and his face had an expression she had only seen on it in private moments, an openness that was not his public face, the face of a man who was genuinely pleased and not bothering to modulate it. "I've been riding horses since I was 4 years old," he said. "I know," she said. "This is different." "It is entirely different," he said. Ramon, who had been watching from the fence, made a sound that was carefully not a comment. It was in these weeks that Dusty Creek began to understand what was happening, as small towns always do, through the accumulation of observations that each individually meant nothing and collectively meant everything. The fact that Clyde Sawyer rode through the southeast corner of his property with some frequency. The fact that Miss Walker had been seen at the Sawyer Ranch on a near-daily basis, which everyone in town knew was about the horse, but which they also considered in its totality. The fact that the two of them had been seen together at the dry goods store on a Thursday afternoon, and had been observed to stand rather close together, while consulting over whether she needed waxed thread or plain thread, a consultation that had taken longer than strictly necessary for the decision involved. The fact that Dolers had mentioned to the woman who ran the seamstress shop that Mr. Sawyer had come to breakfast 2 Sundays in a row in a good shirt rather than his working shirt, without any particular occasion to account for it. Dusty Creek considered all of this and nodded to itself with satisfaction. Stella was in her kitchen garden one afternoon when she heard raised voices from the direction of the road, and came around the side of the house to find 2 men on horses at her gate, neither of whom she recognized. They were trail-worn and had the quality of men who were between purposes, which in the territory in 1882 was a description with a wide range of implications. "You're on the wrong property," she said, from a distance of 20 feet. The closer man looked at her. He was perhaps 40, with a beard that had not been attended to in some weeks. "We're looking for the Sawyer Ranch," he said. "It's north and west of here," she said. "Follow the fence." He looked at her property, at her house, at the corral where Luna and Rio were visible. "You alone out here?" he said. She met his eyes. "I have everything I need," she said, which was not quite an answer to his question but was, she felt, the correct response. The man held her gaze for a moment and then looked away first, which settled the matter, and the two of them turned their horses and went up the road. She told Clyde about it that evening when he came for dinner. He listened with the specific attentiveness he brought to things that concerned her, and she recognized in it both the genuine care and a residual Western male instinct that she was going to need to address. "I want to be clear," she said, setting down her fork. "I handled it, I'm telling you, because you share a road, not because I need you to handle anything." He looked at her across the table. The lamplight was warm between them and the night outside the window was full of stars. "I know you handled it," he said. "I know you can handle things." "But," she said. "No, but," he said. "I worry. That's different from thinking you can't manage." She considered this distinction. It was genuine. She could see in his face that he was not being diplomatic, that he was telling her the precise truth about the difference between his concern and any assumption of her incapacity. "All right," she said. "I'll accept worry." "That's generous of you," he said, and this time he did not restrain the smile at all. She threw her napkin at him, which she later considered to be the exact moment at which formality between them finally and completely dissolved. Coronado went on his first long ride in early May. Clyde rode him out to the south pasture and back, 3 miles in the afternoon, and the horse moved beautifully, responsive and forward and unconcerned. And when they came back to the corral yard, Stella was waiting at the fence with Cinder beside her, and Clyde dismounted, and his face had the look of a man who has just had something confirmed that he had suspected was possible but had not let himself entirely believe. "Thank you," he said. He said it simply, with his full attention on her. "You did the work," she said. "You taught me how," he said. She looked at Coronado, who was breathing easily, nostrils wide, the picture of a horse that had done a good day's work and knew it. "He did well," she said. "He did," Clyde agreed. He was still looking at her. She looked back at him. "Stella," he said. "Yes," she said. "You're the most extraordinary person I have ever met," he said. He said it the way he said most important things, without embellishment, without performance, in the direct, clear way of a man who has decided that something is true and is simply stating it. She felt the words land somewhere deep and sure. "That's a considerable thing to say," she said. "I've thought about it a considerable amount," he said. She was still leaning on the fence rail, and he was standing on his side of it, and the space between them was a matter of inches. He reached out and put his hand over hers where it rested on the top rail. She turned her hand over so that her palm was against his. The mountains in the distance were blue and gold in the late afternoon, and Coronado was at the water trough, and the ranch was going about its evening business all around them, and they stood at the fence with their hands together in the warm May light, and it was quiet and full and completely sufficient. The summer came in hot and bright, and it was the best summer Stella Walker had ever spent, which she recognized was a remarkable thing to say about a summer in which she worked harder than she had ever worked in her life. She completed her stable, a proper four-stall structure with a good roof and ventilation she had calculated carefully for the desert heat. She cultivated her kitchen garden. She added a fenced pasture behind the house for Rio and Luna, who had by now settled into a companionable routine, with Cinder that involved what appeared to be a complicated and entirely negotiated social order. She began to think about adding to her property, not necessarily in terms of acreage, though she had inquiries out about the 20 acres adjacent on the eastern side, but in terms of productivity. What could she grow? What could she raise? What could this land sustain, and what could she build that would last? She was also, by now, in love with Clyde Sawyer in a way that was not the frantic or anxious thing she had heard love described as by people who seemed to regard it primarily as a disruption. What she felt was more like the phenomenon she had noticed with the best horses, a fundamental recognition, a sense that two natures had found their complementary points and settled into them, not because they were the same but because they aligned. He was serious where she was playful. She was patient where he was forward. He knew the land and the cattle and the politics of the territory. She knew horses in a way he was only beginning to understand, and she knew people in a way he sometimes struggled with, because he was better at being direct than he was at navigating the oblique. Together, they made a sum that was larger than the parts, and she felt this every time they were together and sometimes sharply when they were not. He loved her. She knew this not from any single dramatic declaration, though those came, in his particular way, which was to say carefully considered, and then stated with the full force of his conviction, but from the accumulated evidence of 100 smaller things. The way he listened to her with his complete attention. The way he took her opinions on ranch matters seriously, not as a courtesy but as a genuine resource, frequently saying, "What do you think?" with the expectation of a substantive answer. The way he had spoken to Ramon and the hands about her in a way that had clearly established, without being heavy-handed about it, that she was a person of standing and knowledge whose word on matters of horses carried full weight. The way he held her hand at the end of evenings on her porch, both of them looking at the mountains, no urgency, just the pleasure of that particular quiet. He came to her on a Sunday evening in July, dressed in his good shirt, and he had with him a small object wrapped in cloth that he held with the particular care of something that mattered. He sat across from her on the porch in the deep summer evening with the fireflies just beginning in the grass, which was not something she had expected in the territory and which still delighted her, and he held the cloth-wrapped object in his hands and said her name. Stella. She looked at him. This was my mother's, he said, and unwrapped the cloth to show her a ring, a small thing of gold with a stone set in it, dark red, garnet, or ruby, she couldn't be certain, and the stone caught the evening light and held it. She looked at the ring and then at him. I know you came out here to build something on your own, he said, and I want to be clear that I'm not asking you to give that up. I wouldn't. Your 40 acres are yours, and your horses are yours, and your work is yours. What I'm asking is whether you would consider, whether it would be possible for you to, he stopped, which was unusual for him, and she understood from the stopping that this was important enough to make him careful with words in a way he was not usually careful. I'm asking you to marry me, he said, not because I need you to, but because I would like to spend the rest of my life in the company of the person I consider most worth knowing. The fireflies were coming up brighter now in the dark grass, and the mountains were silhouettes against a sky still faintly violet in the west. And she looked at Clyde Sawyer with his mother's ring and his good shirt and his entirely honest face. I would like that very much, she said. He put the ring on her finger and then held her hand, and they sat in the dark for a while without speaking, which was, for both of them, entirely sufficient. Dolors, when told the following morning, produced tears of genuine happiness and an immediate and fervent discussion of what the wedding feast should consist of, which conversation she conducted primarily with herself, listing dishes, and revising the list with the concentration of a general planning a campaign. Ramon shook Clyde's hand once firmly, and then looked at Stella and said, "He is better since you came," and she understood this to be among the most generous things she had ever been told. They were married in September when the heat had broken, and the air had that particular quality of the New Mexico autumn, clear and bright, and with a crispness at the edges that made the world feel more vivid than usual. The ceremony was at the church whose paint was peeling, officiated by the minister, a young man from Ohio named Prescott who was earnest and perfectly competent. The town came, which was to say everyone came, because in a town of Dusty Creek size there was no meaningful distinction between the two. Tucker and his wife were there, and Hector, and Prout sweating in his best suit, and the hands from the ranch, and Dolors in a dress the color of autumn and with flowers from her kitchen garden in her hair. Stella wore a dress she had made herself, cream-colored with a simple cut that suited her, and she had her hair up with 2 combs that had been her mother's, which she had carried in the battered saddlebag all the way from Wichita. She walked into the church without someone to give her away, because she had considered this and decided that she was not something that needed giving, and Prescott had been perfectly accommodating when she had explained this to him, because he was from Ohio and therefore somewhat more flexible on such matters than the territory sometimes produced. Clyde was waiting at the front of the church in the dark coat he kept for occasions, his dark hair combed, and his face with that quality of open and unmodulated feeling that she had come to love precisely because it was so rarely performed. When she reached him, he took both her hands and he looked at her and he said, low enough that only she could hear, "You are the most remarkable thing I have ever seen." "That's the second time you've said something like that," she said. "I'll keep saying it until I've found every way to say it," he said. The minister began, and the words rose in the small church, and outside the autumn light was making everything golden, and she held Clyde's hands and said the words she meant as she had always done everything, with her full attention and without reservation. They went home to the ranch house, because the decision had been made that they would live in the ranch house, and that her 40 acres would operate as a horse property, which had been her idea. She would breed and train horses on her land, which would remain in her name, and the operation would serve both the ranch and, in time, a clientele beyond it. This was agreed on by both of them not as a compromise, but as a plan, carefully made together over several evenings with coffee and maps, and the kind of conversation that has the quality of architecture. She moved her things from the small house she had built with her own hands, which she was not entirely unsentimental about, but which she left standing in good repair because it would be needed for the horse operation, for Hector to eventually live in when he was old enough, and she gave him the permanent position she had been planning to offer him. The ranch house was large enough to be initially bewildering. She had 3 rooms that were hers to arrange as she chose, and she brought her books and her father's old rope, and the few things she had carried from Kansas, and mixed them with the things that had always been there, and the house became, over several weeks, a house that contained both of them. Dollars remained as cook, and as the particular authority on all matters of household management that she had always been, and Stella learned quickly that this was a situation to appreciate rather than navigate around, because Dollars was exceptional, and also because Dollars had decided very early that Stella was worthy of the approval she had previously withheld from all candidates, and the warmth of that approval was a considerable thing. The autumn was golden and busy and full. Stella established her horse operation on the 40 acres, which she called Walker's Creek for the stream that ran through it. She had Rio and Luna and Cinder, and she purchased 2 more horses before the winter, a young mare of mixed Mustang blood that she called Sage, and a long-backed sorrel gelding that she called Pepper, who had come from a livery stable in Santa Fe where he had been miserable. She trained all of them with the same patient intelligence, and began quietly putting the word out that Walker's Creek was where you brought the horses other people had given up on. The word, in a territory where horses were the fundamental unit of transportation and labor, and in many cases the difference between life and a hard death, spread with considerable speed. Clyde rode Coronado every day, and the horse had become, under the combination of Stella's foundational work and Clyde's developing skill as a rider, one of the finest animals in the county. People asked about him, and Clyde said, simply and accurately, "My wife trained him," and let the implications settle where they would. They fell into the rhythms of a shared life the way she had hoped and half feared they would, not by losing their individual natures, but by building something around them both. She rose early, and he rose early, and they had coffee together before either of them went to their separate work, and those mornings, she thought, were some of the best hours of her life. The mountains in the kitchen window, the smell of the coffee, his voice, still rough with sleep, saying whatever was on his mind, her voice, already precise at any hour, answering, the gray horse and Cinder visible in the corral beyond the window, moving in the early light. She missed very little about the life she had not chosen to live. She thought sometimes about the women she had known in Wichita who had told her she was foolish to come out here, who had said, with the authority of people who have decided a thing, that the frontier would destroy her. She thought about the land agent in Albuquerque and his condolences. She thought about the men at the post office in Dusty Creek who had laughed, on her first morning, at the woman on the roan horse. None of them were wrong about the frontier. It was hard, and it was demanding, and it was beautiful in the specific way of things that are genuinely dangerous, and it did not care about your feelings. What they had been wrong about was the conclusion they drew from that, which was that hardness was the enemy of the person who came to meet it. She had not found the frontier an enemy. She had found it exactly what she needed, a place that would tell her, without sentiment, what she was actually capable of, and would reward the answer honestly. She was capable, it turned out, of quite a lot. In November she became aware, through the evidence of her own body and then through confirmation from the town's doctor, a small thin man from Vermont named Aldous, that she was pregnant. She told Clyde on a Sunday evening on the porch with the cold air of the new season coming off the mountains, and the way his face changed when she told him was something she knew she would keep for the rest of her life, the way you keep the image of a particularly extraordinary sky, because it was the full unguarded version of a man who has received information so good that he cannot perform anything about it, can only feel it completely. He pulled her close with the gentleness he kept. She had learned, specifically for her, and set her name into her hair, and she sat against him in the cold evening with the stars appearing one by one over the mountains, and felt the deep settledness of a life that was working. The winter was long and she worked through most of it, because horses did not take the season off and neither did she. Hector came 3 days a week even in the cold and was becoming, under her teaching and his own natural aptitude, a genuinely skilled hand with the horses, which she had been hoping for. She had several inquiries from ranchers in the county about training services, and she accepted 2 of them, working a pair of young horses through January and February, with the result that both their owners were astonished and both of them told other people, and the reputation of Walker's Creek grew accordingly. She found that pregnancy agreed with her in the physical sense. She was strong and her energy remained good through most of it, and agreed with her in the deeper sense too, which she had been less certain about. She had not known whether she wanted children or, more precisely, she had known she wanted them someday in the abstract way of things that are genuinely desired but not yet examined. Examined now, she found the want was real and the expansion of it was a pleasure, though she also thought carefully about what it meant for her work and made plans accordingly. Clyde was careful and attentive without being suffocating, which she had been somewhat worried about given that he was a man with strong protective instincts. But he had understood from the beginning of their relationship that her independence was not something to be protected around but to be respected within, and he held to this even when she could see, sometimes, that it required effort. She gave him credit for the effort. The spring came back around with the particular joy of a thing that has been absent long enough to be genuinely missed, and in late March she went into labor with the help of the Dr. Aldous and Dolers, who had delivered children before and who took charge of the situation with the authority she brought to all situations. And Clyde sat in the parlor for 6 hours with Ramon for company, and both of them were very quiet. It was a boy, 7 pounds, and loudly opposed to his arrival in the world, which Stella found reassuring as evidence of strong lungs and a clear sense of self. She held him in the lamplight in the bedroom while Clyde sat beside her on the edge of the bed and looked at his son with an expression she had no word for, the particular wonder of a person encountering something so new that all existing categories of feeling are insufficient. "Henry," she said. He looked at her. "For my father," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Henry James Sawyer," he said. "For your father and mine." His father's name had been James. She looked at him across the baby in her arms. "That's right," she said. Henry James Sawyer was a person of considerable character from very early in his existence, which surprised no one who knew his parents. He was curious and determined and extremely interested in horses before he could walk, which was either genetics or environment or most likely both. He was put on Cinder's back for the first time at 18 months, held securely by his father with his mother on the lead rope, and he showed no fear whatsoever, only that focused attention that was entirely familiar on a Sawyer face, and that was, in this instance, pointed in the direction of a horse. "Natural," Stella said, watching him. "He had a good teacher," Clyde said, meaning her, and she smiled. The horse operation at Walker's Creek expanded. She hired Hector permanently when he turned 17, giving him the small house on the property, and a wage that was fair by any measure of the territory. She took on a second part-time hand, a young woman named Maria whose family had a ranch to the east, and who had shown up one afternoon asking if Stella needed help, and had proven to have a gift for the work that Stella recognized and cultivated with the same patience she brought to horses. She had space for 8 horses by now in the expanded stable, and she was regularly at capacity. She was known throughout the county. Walker's Creek horses were known. When ranchers or travelers or the occasional army post quartermaster had a horse that was troubled or untrained or had gone wrong somewhere in its handling, the answer they received from knowledgeable people was the same: take it to Stella Walker at Walker's Creek. She'll sort it. She was 26 years old, and her hair had new lines of weather in it, and her hands were strong and sure from the years of work, and she was the most content she had ever been in her life. There were still the usual difficulties of the territory. A drought in the summer of 1883 that put the whole region under strain, requiring careful management of the water from her creek and careful negotiation with Clyde about how the water rights were shared across the property boundary, which they handled with the directness that characterized all their dealings, coming to an agreement that was fair and practical, and that served both operations. There was a dispute with a rancher from the north part of the county who claimed that one of her horses was rightfully his, a claim that was entirely false, and that she demonstrated with paperwork and the testimony of Tucker and her bill of sale, and ultimately before a territorial judge in Santa Fe who found in her favor with the specific decisiveness of a man who had heard too many frivolous claims and could recognize a solid one. Clyde had ridden with her to Santa Fe for the hearing without her asking him to, and he had not spoken on her behalf in the courtroom. That had not been necessary, and they both knew it. But he had been there at the back of the room, and she had known he was there, and that had been exactly enough. In the spring of 1884, she was pregnant again. This time it was easier in some respects and harder in others, because Henry was not yet 2, and was in a state of continuous energetic exploration that required supervision of the specific kind that a pregnant woman manages as best she can while still insisting on doing most of her usual work. Hector took on more at Walker's Creek during these months, and Clyde made arrangements with one of the ranch wives to help with Henry 2 days a week, and Dolores, who had appointed herself the authority on all things related to the children, as she had appointed herself the authority on all things domestic, provided the kind of reliable and confident management of the household that freed Stella to work in the mornings without spending her entire mental energy on logistics. The second child arrived in November, a girl. Stella held her daughter in the first lamplight of her existence and felt the specific and slightly different love of a second child, which was not less than the first but was different in its character, less astonished and more welcoming, like greeting someone you have been told about and are very glad to finally meet. "Clara," Stella said. "For your mother." Clyde had told her once that his mother had been named Clara May. He was beside her again on the edge of the bed, and his face did the same thing it had done with Henry, the full unguarded wonder, and he reached out and touched his daughter's cheek with the very tip of one finger, with a gentleness that was never public and was always real. "Clara May Sawyer," he said. Henry met his sister the following morning with the focused assessment of a toddler examining something new and potentially significant. He stood by the bed with his chin on the mattress and looked at her for a long time. Then he said with considerable gravity, "Horse." "Not a horse," Stella said. "Your sister." Henry considered this. He appeared to file it in an acceptable category and moved on. Dolores cried again, with the same genuine feeling she had brought to the wedding and to Henry's birth, and made an exceptional soup. The years of the mid-1880s moved in the way that good years move, not slowly but with a quality of fullness that makes them feel, in retrospect, spacious. Walker's Creek became what Stella had envisioned, and then became more than she had envisioned, because the reality of a thing you have built is always more complicated and surprising than the plan of it. She found that she could breed horses, not just train them, and that the foals that came from her careful selections of bloodlines, combining the stamina of the Mustang-bred stock with the refinement of the better quarter-horse lines, were horses that people wanted. She had a waiting list. This still surprised her sometimes when she thought about it, the specific fact of people waiting to acquire something she had created, which felt like the clearest possible evidence that she had found the right place and the right work. Clyde's ranch grew too, through the same years of careful management and expansion. The debt his father had left now fully paid, and a modest prosperity replacing it. He had a good eye for cattle and for the land, and he had become, between his own expertise and what he had learned from Stella about horses, a genuinely accomplished rider and horseman in the fuller sense, the one that went beyond skill to understanding. Coronado, now 8 years old, was the finest working horse in the county, and Clyde rode him with the easy, communicative partnership that Stella had built into the horse from the beginning. People who did not know the story sometimes commented on this, and Clyde always told it accurately. "My wife trained him, taught me to ride him properly too. Charged me nothing, which I considered incredibly generous, though she did point out that I was 30 feet into her property at the time." This story was told in various forms throughout the county and eventually in Santa Fe, where it became part of the reputation of Walker's Creek. Henry turned 5 and rode his first solo circuit of the Walker's Creek pasture on a gentle gray pony named Biscuit that Stella had specifically acquired and trained with Henry in mind. She stood at the fence and watched him go around, straight-backed and focused, his father's jaw set in his smaller face, and she thought about her own father standing at a fence watching her, and the continuity of it, the thing that passes forward through time between people who love horses and pass that love on. Clara was a different proposition entirely. She loved horses with the same completeness as her brother but showed, from very early, a preference for the house and the garden and the making of things, and she had Dolar's cooking manner down before she was 3, standing on a stool and stirring with absolute seriousness. She was sharp and funny, and had Stella's directness and Clyde's steadiness in a combination that seemed likely to be formidable when it reached its full expression. In the summer of 1886, Geronimo surrendered to General Miles at Skeleton Canyon, and the long, complicated, painful end of the Apache resistance became official. Stella heard about it in Dusty Creek and sat for a while in the dry goods store after the storekeeper told her, not sure exactly what she felt, which was always the sign of something complex. It was not a simple thing to feel. The end of violence and the end of a people's freedom are not the same event, even when they happen simultaneously, and she had always held both of those truths at once without being able to reconcile them, and she could not reconcile them now. She talked about it with Clyde that evening on the porch, both of them with coffee going cold in their hands, the way they talked about all the things that were too large for easy resolution but too important to ignore. "My father would have said that we're living on land that has a much longer history than our deeds acknowledge," Clyde said. "He would have been right," she said. They sat with that. They could not change the particular injustice of history, but they could, and did, operate with an honesty about it that Stella considered the minimum requirement of being a decent person in a world that had been made partially at the expense of others. Walker's Creek had, by 1887, become what might be called an institution in its small but definite way. Stella had 2 full-time hands, including Hector, now 18 and a skilled horseman in his own right with his own growing reputation. She had trained nearly 100 horses in 5 years. She had consulted with the Territorial Agricultural Office on horse management practices, which still struck her as remarkable. They had asked her, a woman, to advise them, which meant the territory had moved at least a small distance from its starting position, though she did not allow herself to overstate this as a victory given how far there still was to go. She was not yet 30 years old. On a Sunday morning in October of that year, she was sitting on the porch at the ranch house with her coffee, and Henry was in the yard with a stick he had decided was a horse, and Clara was asleep inside. And Clyde came out with his coffee and sat in the chair beside her, and they were looking at the mountains, which were beginning to show their autumn colors, the gold of the aspen against the dark green of the pines. She thought about the morning she had ridden into Dusty Creek 5 years ago, the 3 men by the post office, the land agent's condolences, the wavering map that Prout had drawn. She thought about the fallen wall of her first house and the long first week of sleeping under the stars. She thought about Tucker's corral and the bay stallion circling in his fear, and the dun mare in the corner, and the man on the gray horse at the gate. She looked at Clyde, who was watching Henry trying to get his stick horse to jump over a rock, with the expression of a father who finds this both ridiculous and completely wonderful. "I was told the frontier would break me," she said. He looked at her. "I know," he said. "Several people told me similar things about you before you'd been here a week. I was told the woman who'd bought the southeast corner would be gone by winter." "What did you think?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, considering it honestly the way he considered things. "I thought that anyone who could do what I saw you do with Tucker's horses," he said, "had not been adequately assessed by the people making that prediction." She smiled at the mountains. "I thought," he said more quietly, "that I hoped they were wrong." Henry fell off his stick horse with considerable drama, landed on the soft grass, sat up, assessed himself, decided he was fine, picked up the stick and got back on. "Henry," Stella called, "keep your balance over your feet." "Mama, it's just a stick," Henry said. "Everything is practice," she said. "That's what you always say." "Because it's always true." Henry looked at the stick with the resigned acceptance of a child who has understood that his mother is very often right even when it is inconvenient. He adjusted his position. Clyde was laughing quietly beside her, and she looked at him, and his face was in the full sunlight of the October morning, and the 5 years between that first day on the road and this day on the porch were in his face in the way that good years live in a person's face, not as marks of damage, but as marks of fullness. She reached over and covered his hand with hers on the arm of the chair. He turned his hand and held hers, the same gesture as the first time at the corral fence, but carrying now 5 years of mornings and evenings and the weight of everything they had built and said and done. "I want to be very clear about something," she said. "All right," he said. "I am thoroughly, entirely happy," she said. "I want that to be on record." He looked at her and the smile came, the full one, the one that used all the lines. "It's on record," he said. "So am I." Henry fell off the stick horse again. Clara, who had apparently woken up, appeared in the doorway in her nightdress and looked at her brother with the evaluative eye of a younger sibling cataloging data for future use. "He keeps falling," Clara said. "He keeps getting back up," Stella said. "That's the important part." Clara thought about this with the seriousness she brought to most things. "All right," she said, and went back inside, presumably to discuss the matter with Dolers. The afternoon of that same Sunday, Stella went to Walker's Creek to check on 2 new horses she had taken in the previous week. A pair of Mustang Cross fillies that a rancher from the North County had brought her, wild caught and halter broken only, not yet started under saddle. She was in the first stages with them, the stage of simply being present without demand, letting them grow accustomed to her existence as a neutral, and then increasingly trustworthy thing in their world. She stood in the corral in the afternoon light with the 2 fillies moving around her, their curiosity gradually overtaking their wariness, and she heard horses on the road and looked up, and it was Clyde, coming along the track on Coronado with Henry in front of him in the saddle, the way he sometimes rode with the boy on Sunday afternoons. They stopped at the fence and Henry leaned over to watch the fillies with the intensity of a 5-year-old who has already been told more than most adults know about horses. "They're scared," Henry said. "They are," Stella said. "What do we do when something is scared?" Henry thought carefully. "We don't chase it," he said. "We let it know we're safe." "That's right," she said. Clyde looked at his son, who was saying verbatim the things his mother had taught him, with the focused confidence of a child who has absorbed something real and knows it. He looked at Stella. She looked at him. Between them and Henry and the 2 fillies learning, in their own time, that the world could be trusted, there was something complete and good and entirely their own. The sun was going down over the mountains and making everything gold, and Walker's Creek was running clear and cold over its rocks, and Coronado stood steady at the fence because he had been taught, with patience and intelligence and love, that the world was something he could stand in without fear. That night, after Henry was asleep and Clara was asleep and Dolers had gone to her own quarters, and the house was quiet, Stella and Clyde sat at the kitchen table with the lamp low between them and a pot of coffee, and the letter she had received that week from the Territorial Agricultural Office asking if she would be willing to give a formal presentation on her training methods at a conference in Santa Fe in the spring. She had read it twice. "You should go," Clyde said. "I know," she said. "You should take Henry," he said. "He's old enough to remember it." She looked at the letter and then at him. "You've already thought about all of this," she said. "I think about things that concern you," he said. "It's more or less constant." She folded the letter and set it on the table between them. "I want to do it," she said. "I want to stand in a room full of men who know horses and tell them something true about how to understand them." "I know," he said. "It's going to be excellent." She looked at him. He said it without irony, without qualification, without any shadow of the Territory's instinct to moderate a woman's ambition. He said it the way he said all things that were true, directly and with conviction. "I love you," she said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "I know," he said. "I love you. It's ongoing." She laughed. The lamp flickered. The mountains outside the window held the last of the day's warmth, and the New Mexico night came in its full beauty around the house that had always been his and was now completely theirs, and the 40 acres of Walker's Creek were quiet in the dark with the horses in their stalls, and the children were sleeping, and everything that had been built from the beginning was still standing, more solid than it had ever been, still growing. She had been told the frontier would break her. She had broken 2 horses before noon on the day she proved them wrong, and the rancher at the gate had asked her to teach him, and she had said yes, and they had built something together from that afternoon at Tucker's corral to this night at the kitchen table that was nothing like what anyone had predicted and everything like what she had wanted, and it was, in every particular, enough. It was more than enough. It was whole. In the spring, she went to Santa Fe. She stood in a room of ranchers and territorial officials and a few military men, and she talked for 2 hours about the way horses think and learn, and what it means to build trust rather than enforce submission. And the room, which had begun with the quality of polite skepticism, ended with a silence of genuine attention. And then questions. Good ones, from men who were trying to understand something they had not previously had language for. She answered every one of them clearly and without deference and with the full weight of 15 years of knowledge, and when she was done, the man who ran the conference, a large cattleman from Dona on a county named Prescott who was not the same Prescott as the minister, said, "Ma'am, I've been working horses for 30 years and I have learned more in the last 2 hours than in the last decade. I hope you'll come back next year." She said she would consider it. Henry, who had sat in the back of the room and watched his mother with the specific attention of a child for whom a parent has just fully revealed a dimension of themselves previously known only in smaller pieces, was quiet on the ride home in the wagon. Then he said, "Mama, will you teach me all of it?" "I've been teaching you since you could walk," she said. "I mean all of it," he said. "Everything you told those men." She looked at her son in the spring afternoon, 5 years old and already aiming at the full version of things. "Yes," she said, "all of it." Clyde was waiting at the gate of the Sawyer ranch when they came up the track in the afternoon, and Henry jumped from the wagon before it stopped and ran to his father with the news of everything he had seen and heard. And Clyde lifted him and listened and looked across the yard at Stella, who was climbing down from the wagon with her saddlebag, and the rolled notes from her presentation and her mother's comb still in her hair, and he looked at her the way he always looked at her, with the full attention of a man who had never stopped finding her remarkable. She walked to the gate and he put Henry down, and Henry ran toward the house already looking for Clara, and Clyde stood at the gate with the late afternoon light on his face. "How was it?" he said. "Good," she said. "How good?" "Very good," she said and smiled. He opened the gate for her and she walked through, and he fell into step beside her toward the house, and the ranch was going about its evening around them, and the mountains in the last light were extraordinary. "They invited me back next year," she said. "Of course they did," he said. She took his hand as they walked. The frontier had not broken her. She had broken it open instead. The way a good horse breaks open when it finally trusts, not into compliance but into itself, into the full and working version of what it was always capable of being. She had found in it not defeat but discovery, not hardship as punishment but hardship as instruction, and she had found beside her in it a man who understood both of those things, who had stood at a fence on a May afternoon and watched her work and had had the great good sense to ask her to teach him. She had said yes, to the teaching and to all of it. They walked home in the last of the day's light, and the door of the ranch house opened ahead of them and the sound of the children came out of it, and Dolor's voice with its particular authority, and the smell of the evening meal, and Clara appeared in the doorway in her dress with her serious expression and said, "Mama, Henry says you told those men everything," and Stella said, "I told them quite a lot," and Clara said, "Did they listen?" And Stella said, "They did," and Clara nodded with the satisfaction of someone for whom listening is the correct response, and held the door open for them both. They went inside. The door closed on the evening. And the frontier, in all its vast and demanding beauty, lay quiet around the house where a woman had come alone with a battered saddlebag and a horse and an idea of herself that no one else had yet been able to fully see, and had built, from the good ground up, a life that was everything she had meant it to be and more besides, full of love and horses and the endless, patient, rewarding work of teaching the frightened world to trust.